very much, Bill. Those are very salutary comments. Are we talking about violence or are we talking about evil? But we are this afternoon going to talk about etiology, understanding of why some people become violent. I've got 25 minutes. I'll spend about 50 minutes on some basic, boring neurobiology, which will put you to sleep after your lunch. And then I'll finish on a 10-minute case study, trying to link that to the law. First of all, several important caveats. If you forget anything else I say or everything else I say, don't forget these points. I'm talking about predispositions only. There's no causality in anything that I have to say. There are no one-to-one relationships between neurobiology on the one hand and violence on the other. There are none. Biological predispositions do not negate the importance of social etiology and social causation. And lastly, there are no biomarkers that are diagnostic. 4 very important points to bear in mind. Having said all that, let's turn to genetics. Genetic basis to violence, crime, antisocial behavior. Does that exist? Absolutely. Without any shred of a doubt, there is a genetic basis to antisocial, aggressive, and violent behavior. More than 10 years ago, Moffitt put these 100 studies together, averaging out, you know, God is quite fair, 50% genetic explanation of variability and violence, 50% environmental. So, first and foremost, there is, without doubt, a genetic basis to antisocial behavior. The more pertinent question for you is, which genes amongst the 20,000 are the culprits? Which ones are the guilty genes? That we don't know. The closest we come to is a genotype which confers low levels of monoamine oxidase A. Those individuals are the red line. We've got antisocial behavior on the y-axis, but only in combination with severe physical abuse. That was the key paper in Science 2002 by Caspi, Moffitt, and others. This interaction effect has been replicated in a number of studies. Of course, there are failures to replicate, but overall, there does seem to be a linkage. But generally speaking, by and large, with genome-wide association studies, it's very difficult for us to explain 1% of any pathology, whether it's depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. Very hard to locate genes that account or explain more than 1% of the variants. Bear that in mind. Now, we've been talking a lot of brain imaging. I'm going to move away a bit from brain imaging to begin with. I'm moving away from molecular genetics. Question then. Don't count this in my time, please, Molly. These are standardized scores. So, you know, we're not talking about, you know, people up here perfectly or entirely antisocial. These are just scores on this axis, basically. A bit like personality score, a bit like an IQ score, like height, weight. Just think of it that way. Oh, absolutely not. A few percent if we combine the genetic with the environmental. Start the clock again. Here. Right. So I'm turning away from brain imaging, fancy molecular genetics, going to something very basic. But I'm interested in what early factors, early on in life, raise the odds that someone will become violent, because that's important for prediction, right? So this is a study we did on over 4,000 babies showing that individuals, this group here, who had birth complications, combined with maternal rejection of the child in the first year of life, that group were more likely to commit violent crimes 34 years later. Doesn't matter if it's 18 years later or 34 years later. This group have neither birth complications nor maternal rejection in the first year of life. This group only had the maternal rejection. This only the birth complications. This had the double whammy. And you get a threefold increase in violence. But again, most people in this group do not become violent.
What do you mean by maternal rejection?
Stop. Maternal rejection of the child is characterized in 3 ways. First of all, the mother did not want the pregnancy to begin with. Secondly, she made an attempt to abort the fetus, but she failed these alive male births. Thirdly, the child was institutionalized for at least 4 months in the first year of life, hence breaking the mother-infant bonding process during a critical period, which we believe affects later personality development.
Sure. control for the rejection where the kid does not know the mother didn't want the kid?
That was not assessed in the study. Intriguing point. Did the kid ever know that the mother didn't want? We don't know. We don't know about those conversations, but they could have done. But there's no main effect, surprisingly, of maternal rejection. Right. Okay. Those findings replicate. This is a Danish sample. These replicate out in America. They replicate out in Sweden. They replicate out in Canada. So there's something going on very early on in life, and we think birth complications has a negative effect on brain functioning. But it's an indirect proxy. What else is going on there even before the birth? Nicotine, cigarette smoking. Big sample by my postdoc, Patty Brennan, now at Emory, 4,000 sample, assessing mothers smoking cigarettes during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. On the y-axis, we have violent crime. Mothers who don't smoke any 1 or 2 cigarettes, 3 to 10, more than 20. She finds a dose-response relationship. The more controlling for all of the social compounds, social background factors, controlling for those, there's added value in cigarette smoking during pregnancy, predicting to later adult violence. There are many more than 8 other studies showing this same relationships. It's unassailable, even controlling for social confounds there. Just another example from Finland here by Rissanen, very large sample of 5,000. Smoking during pregnancy and the nicotine exposure to the fetus doubles the rate of adult violence. Combine cigarette smoking with other social risk factors that we know raise the odds, then that leads to a 9 times increase in rate of convictions in adulthood and a 14-fold increase in recidivism in adulthood. We're going prenatally right the way forward. And by the way, why am I talking about this? There's no brain imaging study that's ever been done which has brain scanned the brains of babies at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and looked prospectively to see which are we getting a linkage between brain dysfunction early on and later violent crime. Fetal alcohol syndrome, you'll all be very familiar with this syndrome here. Mothers who take alcohol during pregnancy, nearly 500 of these individuals in one sample by Streisger. You can see the rates of delinquency and police contacts in that sample. I mean, that's high, isn't it? Pop over there. This is in Canada now, showing that youths who have fetal alcohol syndrome are 19 times more likely to be incarcerated. That's an early risk factor that can be assessed, monitored. What does prenatal alcohol do to the brain? This is the brain of a baby that died at 6 weeks. This is the brain of a baby dying at 6 weeks, same age, of fetal alcohol syndrome. How much alcohol do you need to drink during pregnancy to raise the odds of antisocial and aggressive behavior? Would you believe 1 drink a week will raise scores on aggressive behavior at age 7 by 30%? That's a significant increase, even with 1 drink a week. Fascinating study here by Richard Neugebauer. Now I'm turning to nutrition, another factor that affects the brain very early on in life. Richard documented that mothers who have poor nutrition in the 1st or 2nd trimester of pregnancy, their offspring are 2.5 times likely in adulthood to develop antisocial personality disorder. Again, controlling for loads of background demographic social factors. I won't bore you with the studies we have done on poor nutrition at age 3 being associated with aggressive antisocial behavior at 8 years, 11 years, 17 years. There's more studies like that, but that's the best one. A sample of over 100,000. You know, Jeff was talking about the small sample sizes on 10 psychopaths, 10 controls. Why? I'm fascinated with this because I feel I can rely on this a bit more than with small sample data. Okay, let's again take something very boring that nobody here is interested in. It's not fancy, colorful brain scans. It's heart rate. Low resting heart rate is so far the best replicated biological correlate of antisocial behavior in children and adolescents. It's really boring heart rate, and it only takes a minute to measure it, and you don't need any equipment. You can take a pulse, you can measure this. These are effect sizes. I'm going to explain these a bit more. But basically, this is a medium effect and this is a large effect. I'll come on to that issue a little bit later, talking about the strength of the relationship between low resting heart rate and higher aggressive behavior in kids. It replicates across cultures. It's been observed in primates, tree shrews, gibbons, macaques, even rabbits with low heart rate are more dominant and aggressive. This is the only biological marker which is diagnostically specific, meaning low heart rate only relates to antisocial aggressive behavior. It does not relate to depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia. That's very unusual in the field. And it's quite independent of background social confounds in many studies. Remember, we're averaging together 40 studies here in what's called a meta-analysis, combining results together here. Not many longitudinal studies, only 4 have shown prospective relationships. There's no failures to replicate that so far. At least 2 of them show that low heart rate in adolescence is associated with adult criminal convictions after controlling for confounds. One additional recent study from the Netherlands, they took juvenile delinquents, measured heart rate during a stressor, and the juvenile delinquents who show a blunted heart rate response during the stressor are more likely to reoffend 6 years later. But there's very few studies like this. Let me show you something else, something called fear conditioning here. Take that as a biological measure of lack of fear. It's the simplest way to put it. If you have poor fear conditioning, you are lacking in fear. It's measured biologically by putting electrodes on the fingers of 3-year-old children. You're measuring a sweat rate response. I won't go into the paradigm here, but let me say that fear conditioning was assessed in 1,800 children that we did in this study. We followed them up for 20 years. At the end of that time, 137 had a criminal conviction. We matched them carefully on sex, ethnicity, and social adversity. And these are the scores of fear conditioning. The controls do show significant fear conditioning. But the 3-year-old children who become criminals 20 years later do not show significant fear conditioning at the age of 3. Again, controlling for many social confounds there. Okay, well, that was pretty boring, wasn't it? Because it's not fancy brain imaging. But I think they're quite fascinating because they do show, surprisingly, added value, I think, in terms of prediction. And again, we have no studies at all on brain imaging. Quickly, to introduce a bit of the brain imaging, Jeff talked about positron emission tomography. We're looking at glucose metabolism in the brain. We were studying 41 murderers here, comparing them to 41 controls. This just illustrates the finding that while normals show good frontal lobe functioning during a cognitive attention task, that was significantly reduced in murderers. Again, not every murderer is looking like that at all. That's just illustrating the main group finding. These are group data. David's going to be turning to that a bit later. Okay, one swallow doesn't make a summer, does it? What we did here is combined 43 studies which had been done up to this date, looking at brain structure and brain functioning in antisocial groups. Again, doing this meta-analysis. There was a significant effect size, 0.6 Cohen's d. That's a medium effect size. It's not large and it's not small. What does 0.6 really mean as an effect size? Okay, I've got a history, family history of heart illness. I take a baby aspirin every day because it's supposed to lower mortality. What's the strength of that relationship? Baby aspirin and reducing death. The effect size is 0.04. It's a small effect size. What about the strength of the relationship between smoking and lung cancer? That effect size is 0.16. SAT scores, how good are they at predicting later college grade point average? Effect size is 0.4. To get to 0.6, we need to take ADHD kids, and it's how poorly they do on attention tasks. So the point to make here is across 43 studies, at least so far, there's something going on. Relationship, not causality, not causality. Okay, so given that we've got no longitudinal studies in antisocial behavior so far from brain imaging, I've been interested in a neurological condition called cavum septum pellucidum. That refers to a gap or space or cave, if you like, between these two leaflets of white matter running through the lateral ventricles. We know that in normal development there is closure of the septum pellucidum by 6 months after birth. During, so it's a marker for maldevelopment of limbic structures that result normally in closure of septum pellucidum. So we found 17 people in the community with cavum septum pellucidum. We compared them to normal controls where the septum pellucidum is fused. And that fusion again takes place by 6 months after birth. The red bars are those with cavum septum pellucidum, a marker for limbic maldevelopment very early on in life. They have significantly higher scores than the controls in yellow on antisocial personality, psychopathy, more arrests, more convictions. Again, controlling for a lot of background factors. The amygdala, that's been talked about today. We find an 18% volume reduction in the amygdala in our group of psychopaths compared to non-psychopaths. A significant reduction. This is the amygdala here, and these are the deformations in specific areas of the amygdala there. A graduate student, Andrea Glenn, one thing she showed about the amygdala is that that lights up a lot when we are faced with moral dilemmas. If we do an imaging task involving moral dilemmas, you get activation of the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala. In psychopaths, when you put them through the same moral dilemma task, their amygdala activation is reduced. The higher the psychopathy score, the lower the amygdala activation. So psychopaths know right from wrong, but do they have the feeling for what is right and wrong? Right, so I've got, I think, about 10 minutes to go. Is that right? Okay, so what I'll do now is turn from this background neurobiological data. I'm going to try and move in a little bit more to your arena, and I must thank my good friend and colleague Stephen Morsier for putting me on to this case, the case of Michael. And it involves brain imaging, but it's now returning to an individual level. Right, who was Michael? Well, here he is. He was 40 years old. He was in his second marriage, which was stable. And actually, he used to be a correctional officer before he became a school teacher. No prior psychiatric history or history of sexually deviant behavior that at least was significant. Right, what I'll now do is show you just a 3-minute video clip which takes this case a little bit further, because from this point of normality, things began to change a little bit for Michael. I hope I can at least get...
I didn't see any more, didn't hear of any more, had no suspicions of any until February 14, which is Valentine's Day,
I'm having a problem here.
Of 2000.
Let me just go back and try and activate the video.
We're not going to count this on your time.
Well, you know,
Not to worry.
it's my mistake.
I didn't see any more, didn't hear of any more, had no suspicions of any until February 14, which is Valentine's Day of 2000. And I went to put a card, a Valentine's Day card, in his, the carrier that he took to work with him every day. And in there I saw that there was pornography. And I was horrified and so scared, because you can't take porn to school. You just can't do that. You risk everything.
Michael was starting to act out of character in other, more frightening ways.
It seemed as though he was just always on edge, always angry. You know, he was taking pills every day because he was having these massive headaches. I mean, can remember this horrible argument we had on Thanksgiving Day, where he grabbed my hair and actually pulled out, you know, some of my hair. And it was at that point I called a counselor and said, you know, we need some help.
In the months which followed, the stepfather, husband, and high school teacher began to lead a double life.
A ball rolling downhill. It just gained speed. Pornography and strip clubs accelerated and expanded to massage parlors. But all of this is a desire towards grown women.
And then in May, I found a magazine called Barely Legal, which showed young girls who supposedly are legal, but frankly look like they're 13, 14 years old. And I was absolutely furious. I took Christina, she and I went to my mother's to stay with her for a couple of weeks while I thought about what to do. Just sort of like this kind of look of, what?
That's his stepdaughter, Christina.
Anne's daughter Christina was 12 years old when she too started to notice changes in Michael's behavior.
Like, I've always been really, really close to my parents. They would lay down with me at night before I would go to sleep and maybe like singing a lullaby or something like that. And it went on until I was way old. I remember, like, he would lay down with me, and then that's when it started. It would always happen at night.
My wife started a nighttime class 2 days a week. She didn't get home until 10 o'clock at night. But when my stepdaughter laid down with me in her pajamas, I began to, not always, but sometimes, be a little more intimate with her than I should. And somewhere deep, deep, deep in the back of my head, there was a little voice saying, you shouldn't do this. But there was a much larger voice saying, what the heck, why not?
What the heck, why not? So let's just see what further happened to Michael after the headaches began to develop, after he began to get into bed with his stepdaughter. He's found guilty of child molestation. He's offered either a treatment program or prison. He opts for the treatment program, of course. He's legally removed from the home here. However, in the treatment program, he solicits the female staff and he's expelled from the program. So he's now about to face prison. So the night before he's due to go to prison, he goes to hospital complaining of a bad headache. And also he has suicide ideation, and he feels that if he's released from hospital, he'll rape his landlady. So he's admitted to hospital, to the psychiatric ward, under the diagnosis of paedophilia. There he solicits sexual favors from the female staff. And this is important. Michael urinates himself in the hospital and shows no concern about the urination. In fact, he's wet his pants. So an astute neurologist ordered a brain scan. And the brain scan showed that a tumor had grown from the base of the orbitofrontal cortex here, suppressing the frontal region of the brain. And that orbitofrontal or ventral region of the brain is in particular associated with antisocial behavior in imaging studies. So what they did, they resected the tumor, and after the tumor, Michael was ostensibly back to normal. He successfully completed the 12-step Sexaholics Anonymous program that he had been ascribed to by the judge. He even returns home to his wife and the stepchild that he abused, and he's completely normal. And it sounds like a fascinating on-off association, the temporal ordering of events, which is really intriguing. And it should have been happily ever after. But after about 6 months, the headaches came back. Then Michael's wife begins to find child pornography on his computer. She reports it. He's then rescanned, and it's found that, yes, the tumor has grown back again. That's resected for a second time, and to my knowledge, 6 years since then, he's been quite normal in terms of having appropriate sexual behavior. So it's even more an incredible pendulum swinging back and forth from normality to tumor to paedophilia and back again. The question is Michael, Mr. Oft, Stephen's acronym, orbitofrontal tumor, responsible? Right, now you're in the classroom, judges, and I only want the judges here. I would like the judges to raise their hands if they believe that Michael is responsible. Do you like the term, Stephen, responsible? I'm using the word.
That's fine. I would only urge that we think of this as two different times. Time one being the many months before he went to the hospital, and at the time of the resection, because there had clearly been massive deterioration in that period.
Okay, we'll take that. So the first part of the pendulum swing. So, would you find him legally responsible? I'd like you to raise your hand if you would. I'm then going to ask for the other side. Now, would you, right, 1, 2, 2, 3. Any higher than 3? No, you're not. Well, just judges. Hands, judges. Right.
Is this the first time?
Well, Stephen liked the first time.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Whoa. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Hands down. Any judges who would not find him responsible?
I don't know.
Okay, right. So, yes, quite right. He has rational capacity because he knew what he was doing and he knew that what he was doing was wrong. Remember at the end of the videotape, Michael said, you know, there was a little voice in the back of my mind saying, I don't think I should do it. But there was a bigger voice in the front of my mind saying, what the hell, just go on.
But could he control it? What do you mean when you say responsible?
Well,
he knows it's wrong but can't control it. What difference does the knowledge of right and wrong?
That is interesting. Michael, indeed, himself says, I'm responsible, I'm the one to blame. But the next question, the next thing Michael says is intriguing to me, is now whether I should be held as accountable as someone without a tumor? No, I don't think so. And bear in mind that the question I posed you was the issue of responsibility, not in terms of what do we do with Michael after the fact that we find him guilty, because that's a separate question in terms of disposition there. But what I'm curious about, given the fact we've seen emotional blunting in offenders, in psychopathic individuals, the shrinkage of the amygdala, for example, then if in the future we ever revise the responsibility criteria, would we bring in emotion alongside cognition? Not just knowing that what you were doing is wrong, but having the feeling that what you were doing was wrong. Because Michael didn't, I think, have those feelings. He wasn't bothered about urinating himself, for example. And then the last question I want to leave you with is, you know, what about, think about Michael, but then think about those individuals of the type I've spoken about who have predispositions early on in life, which they didn't ask for, that raises the odds of them becoming offenders. It's not as striking as that orbitofrontal tumor. You know, you won't get an expert witness showing this great picture out there, but what if, you know, low heart rate or an 18% reduction in the volume of the amygdala? Would that ever make a difference? And at that point, I think I'll hand over to David, because the question is, you know, should any of this ever be brought up in a court with respect to an individual case? And let us do the switching.